it's almost like the death of the American dream in a really weird way. Like this is a town that like I grew up in Southern California, so I always kind of imagined like Burbank or, certain parts of the valley where, so many of these buildings are just frozen in time, and we're kind of recycling, like with the diner thing, where it's like, oh, we're like recycling this like happy life that was sold to us 5 generations ago.
Welcome, friends, to episode 317 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we discuss Daniel Clowes' 1997 graphic novel, Ghost World. And joining us in Angel's Diner is graphic novels editor Jasmine Amiri. Jasmine's career has spanned 13 years working for multiple publishers, including Oni Press and Boom Studios. She is currently the graphic novels reviews editor at the School Library Journal. Welcome to the show, Jasmine.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
I'm super excited to talk to you about this. Luke has told me a little bit about your background, and I'm a pretty massive comics fan. Like, I grew up on comics. Admittedly, like, these days I don't read as many comics as I would like to, but this is such an interesting project, and thank you for bringing it to my attention. I honestly had no idea that this comic existed, and then I think I'd heard of the film. I just can't wait to dig into this. This was such a fun, kind of nostalgic journey.
I know. I was I was a little nervous. I haven't read this actually since college, and I was listening to your Forrest Gump podcast just to like kind of prep myself for this. And I was like, oh man, if Forrest Gump kind of was offensive, I hope they don't think negative of me.
I think it's an entirely different sort of tone.
Entirely different. No, yeah, I think we'll be fine. We can talk about maybe there are some rough edges. I think
Definitely.
that show from its era, and we try and highlight that stuff. But I think Forrest Gump was particularly deserving of some of that criticism. But it's also like the biggest movie ever, so whatever, it can take it. I do want to note before we get into Ghost World, which we have lots of thoughts about, and I'm very curious to hear about. I wanted to ask you about your career because it's an interesting one. I don't know many editors, and it sounds like you were doing editing work for a long time, but now you work for School Library Journal. But what got you started in comics, and what got you started as an editor?
So I actually went to film school, and by the end of that, I had interned at a big music video production company, and also just doing my senior project, I just realized that I really didn't like the personalities that I was running into all the time, and people were like screaming at each other in offices and on set. And I was also just really, really into comic books at the time. And Jeff Johns, who's a comic book creator, his store was right across the street from my college. So every day I would hop in there between classes and go and buy my Wednesday single issues. And when it came to time to do my internship, I asked my college if I could just do it in comic books because it's also a visual medium, and they said yes. So I actually ended up interning at Boom Studios, and then they kind of hired me right out of college, and that's kind of where it started. And I wasn't in editing initially. I was kind of more on like the operations side, and the first book that I edited was, do you guys know that band Say Anything?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the lead singer, Max Bemis, he was bringing a book to Boom, and I pretty much asked the editor-in-chief, like, I am a huge fan of this band. Can I please edit this? And they were like, yeah, sure, go for it. And that's kind of how I transitioned into editing, and I've just been doing it ever since.
That's awesome. That's an amazing story.
Yeah.
I love, like, starting in film school makes so much sense to go to comics, like having an eye for composition and like thinking visually, but also narratively. We've talked about comics a few times on the podcast, and it's like to me, it's like the ultimate version of both of what we're talking about in terms of like typically narrative filmmaking and then novels or just, I guess, narrative storytelling in general. That's such a cool way into comics. And like, I mean, I assume that you met the member of Say Anything, and like to get the opportunity to work with someone like that you're a fan of is awesome.
Yeah. When I was over at Boom, I kind of got pigeonholed as like the rock star editor. So I was working with like Coed and Cambria, Say Anything. I did Neil Peart's comic, which he
Wow.
co-wrote with Kevin J. Anderson, which was really cool.
That's cool.
Yeah, there was a while where I was getting
Neil Peart's a legend.
Oh yeah, he was great.
Yeah.
He used to send me his calendar of he used to go on like a motorcycle trip every year and just take photos, and he would create a calendar out of it. So that used to be my calendar every year, was Neil Peart's little motorcycle calendar.
Very cool.
That's so cool. So you transitioned from that. You did it for a long time, and now you're working for School Library Journal, which I was looking into because I wasn't super familiar with. And from what I could see, is it's like a magazine, but designed for librarians specifically and other people who like work with children. Is that
Yeah,
accurate?
yeah, no, you nailed it. It's for
Okay.
librarians and educators. It's the same company as the Hornbook and Library Journal, and we mostly do reviews. And yeah, I mean, after I stopped working for Oni a couple years ago, that was about, I think, like 12 years into my career. And I still loved comics and I still loved editing, but I kind of also wanted to maybe shake things up. And this is really great because I'm still editing, still working in comics, but it's, on the reviews end. So it's been nice.
I mean, we kind of review stuff here, although we think of it more as like a craft discussion than a like true review. But yeah, that's what we're into. And James, like you were talking about, I keep thinking like, because I'm still pretty new to comics. I didn't grow up reading them really. I watched lots of cartoons that were adapted from comics, but and I knew lots of movies were originally comics. I just never actually like had the book. Was never like I never went to comic shops or anything, so I wasn't really exposed to it. But every time we get into one of these, I always think it is an interesting medium, and that it's like a bridge between the written word and the visual of a film. And so I think there's like an obvious reason why a lot of them get adapted, because you have a lot of the stuff like right there for you on the page already. And this is a really interesting comic. So let's move into talking about Ghost World. This was a comic and film I had never heard of. When I looked into it, I saw Scarlett Johansson like in the pictures. I was like, oh, so she's in this. Maybe I have heard of it. And I saw some of the stills, and like some of them look somewhat familiar. So like, maybe I've seen a trailer or something, but I've definitely never watched it. Never read this comic, so I was brand new to it going in. And I know, James, same for you, right?
Yeah, I mean, I had heard of the movie, but I didn't realize that it was based on a comic, and it was something. It's a blind spot for me.
Yeah.
Strangely, it's like it really feels like it's in my wheelhouse now that we've approached it, and I see like they have a Criterion release of the film and stuff, and I'm like, this is awesome. I can't wait to dig into this.
That's cool. And researching it, there's some really interesting stuff about the background of this, and like the critical reaction to it when it came out, and all that stuff, and how people feel about it now. But we are going to be focusing in, listener, on just the comic today. I want to give the comic its due, really focus on it. So we haven't seen the film. Jasmine has, but we haven't. So we're going to wait until next week. Jasmine's going to come back. We're going to talk about the movie. So if that's what you're interested in, make sure to check that out next week. But this week we're going to talk about the comic. And I want to know, like, did you read the comic before seeing the film, or did you see the film and then go find the comic?
No, I rented this movie from Blockbuster like a million years ago when I was in high school, and I think I fell in love with the soundtrack first, and I loved all the actors. I loved Steve Buscemi and Thora Birch and Scarlett Johansson, and yeah, I just kind of for a long time it was my favorite movie, and I didn't. I knew it was a comic, but we didn't have really any comic book stores growing up in my hometown. So it wasn't until I think like my freshman year of college that I actually got to read the book, and it was interesting to see how different it is in some ways,
I bet.
and how similar
Yeah, I
it
haven't
is
seen
in
the
other.
movie yet, but I was like, I assume a lot of this is different.
Yeah.
Well, it feels like a comic, like very individual stories that have like a through line that's getting at some message, but I assume the film is going to do a lot more interweaving of a lot of
Well,
this
and
stuff.
I think combined characters would be my guess. One thing I saw, I'll just go ahead and say, this was basically a part of another release that Daniel Clowes did called 8 Ball that he did for years. And he would do like a collection of these short pieces, experimental stuff. And then he would include like a piece from a longer narrative. within each issue. And Ghost World started as one of those, like somewhere along the run of 8-Ball. And so it was just, you'd get like one kind of issue of this at the end of it, or one chapter of this. And even when he started making it, he said that he didn't intend for it to be an ongoing thing. He thought it was just going to be a one-off. But I guess it was popular, or he was interested in continuing it, so he continued it. So it kind of grew organically out of that, which I do appreciate. And that gives me some nice context for like why he's choosing to write this subject matter, which is something we could definitely talk about, is interesting, especially today, to look back at this guy writing about these two teenage girls sort of transitioning out of childhood into adulthood.
So I have a question, Jasmine. As you said, you love the film and you've read the comic. I'm curious, what's the reputation of Ghost World as a comic in that industry at this point?
Reputation-wise, I think it's kind of one of those like fundamental comics that a lot of like really, really big people still reference in terms of like touchstones for things that inspired them. Like I know Craig Thompson, who did Blankets, he said he was really inspired by Daniel Clowes. And I think Ghost World is this really cool kind of like stopgap between like comics with an X, like Robert Crumb and that kind of thing, where it's like really like, I don't know, it's almost like trying to be offensive, or it's just like, people saying their like darkest, worst, most pervasive thoughts in a comic book, to, things that are kind of more like diary or slice of life, or, you're exploring themes like, that weird summer between high school and college and what you're going to do after high school. And I think this book kind of walked so other people could run, I guess. Like they kind of laid the path.
And do you feel like it's like a visual thing as well? Like, do you see a lot of the visual stuff that's carryovers, or is it kind of just like a tone and like a vibe and sort of like a niche thing that people have run with?
I think that Daniel Clowes is definitely known for his visual style as well, because it was very iconic in the 90s. Like he was one of the people alongside Charles Burns also. Do you remember when Coca-Cola did like OK Soda? And it was
I don't, but I read about this.
Yeah. So like
I don't remember.
Yeah, it was like they did this weird release where they had a bunch of like indie comic artists and other artists do like the art for like their soda cans. And they used all these people, like honestly a lot of Fantagraphics artists, who's the publisher of Ghost World. It's a very distinct style. I think that I'm drawn to it, and I think a lot of other people who like comics are drawn to it because it's simple, but if you look in the background, like, or even like the little things that people are reading, like he includes so many little details, and there's so much storytelling happening in every single panel.
Yeah, I was really struck with the subtlety that he uses, because like at first, like I don't think I was picking up on it, and it actually made me like want to go back and start over, because I was realizing that we were moving pretty quickly through scenes, and we would just get a simple panel without much explanation at all. And in fact, throughout the comic, there's, I think, no narration, other than like when somebody's narrating something that happened in the past. So like she's telling a story, and that'll sometimes appear as narration, but it's what she's saying, usually Enid. But yeah, I mean, and then no internal thoughts either. So two things that I feel like we see a lot in comics are just completely absent from this. So because of that, so much of it is just like you said, like looking at little details, the expression on somebody's face or the turn of their body or something will tell the whole story of what's happening in that panel. And then sometimes the next panel will completely move on and they'll be in a whole new area, and you're just left to like look at that thing and go like, okay, what did that say exactly?
That's one of my favorite things I noticed in this book too, is the cuts. Like the transitions between scenes would often be like so abrupt, and I would go back to the previous scene and be like, did I get all the context of what we're doing here? And there'd be a meaning within that, which I love. Again, it's like using the visual style of like editing film or like the language that's been built up to say like there's a reason that was abrupt, and it draws attention to itself. I felt like this was the kind of book where some of the times when I'm reading comics, I'm flying through. This was the kind of book where I would read, then I would really analyze the panel, and then I would move on to the next panel. And it didn't really affect the pacing much, because it was like there was something profoundly like we don't give a fuck about anything, and then also highly emotional happening at the same time. So I don't know. It struck a really interesting chord for me.
Yeah. It's interesting because, the last time I did read this was, like in college. Like I was probably around the age of these characters when I read it, and it was really interesting now as like an adult going back and
They
reading
would judge
it.
the hell out of all of us if they saw us.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
would be so unkind to all of us.
Well, this is why teenagers are scared, right?
Yeah.
This is why.
Absolutely.
But it reminded me of like rewatching Gilmore Girls or something, where it's like, when you watch it when you're a child, you think like, oh my gosh, Lorelai is so cool, what a cool mom. And then when you watch it as an adult, you're like, Lorelai's kind of awful. And the grandparents are like the best people in this show. And that's kind of how I felt about this, where, I think a lot of the things that they were trying to say with this book kind of just went over my head at the time, where Enid is kind of a monster. And, even though some of the stuff that her and Becky do are funny or witty, they're still pretty horrible people. And every single person in this is, a liar. Like even Josh at the end is kind of a liar. And I think that, yeah, it's really interesting how they kind of make you like really, really read between the lines, and then like really, nothing is black and white, and you're not supposed to be rooting for these characters, but you still feel for them when they go through, a friendship breakup or other things that are super relatable. In terms of slice of life, I think that this is very, very real. It just lays it all out. The good, the bad, the ugly, it's all there.
I also feel like there's something relatable about being young enough to not realize that you're being cruel or that you're hurting people. And there's something that like, that's just kind of at that age, you just don't understand. And like prank calling people and having somebody show up to a diner and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It feels so innocent and funny. And then it's like horribly sad and then I think that seeing the characters are confronted by that at some point in the story, it's like some form of growing up every time they're fucking up along the way. Mm-hmm. And I think that's all part of something that I think I would assume most people, I definitely did, go through as you grow up.
So I definitely went through a journey with this, and it touches on what you're both saying. Like, at first I was like, I don't like anybody. Like, I don't like either of them. They're so mean. They're kind of this like disconnected, like classic Gen X of the 90s teenager who is too cool for everything. Everything is beneath them. Everybody they meet is beneath them. They calling out everybody for being hypocrites, and of course being hypocritical themselves. Some pretty rough edges in a lot of the humor. It feels pretty mean spirited. Some of it's homophobic. Some of it's racist. There's different things like that crops up in there. And so at a certain point, I did realize that like that was it felt like it was daring me to still like them. And I was like, why are you daring me to like these characters? And then I kind of realized that the whole point is that, to me, it seems like all of this is like defense mechanisms that they've built because of how, hurt they are. And I don't know, like, I totally empathize with that. Like, the idea that you put on this really rough front and that you aren't sympathetic to people. And then at a certain point, you kind of have to like grow through that and realize that like that's not going to serve you your entire life. You can't really sustain that. And as I saw the characters start to actually grow, and I noticed all the stuff that was going on in the background that would kind of show that like the stuff they're doing is kind of horrible. And, you see evidence of that, like specifically that diner sequence where there's just like a hint of seeing the roses or whatever they were like left on the counter, and you realize that like the guy brought flowers, and it's really sad. And they're like, that wasn't as fun as I thought it would be. And you're like, yeah, it wasn't. There's moments like that sold me on like, okay, so we're watching these characters actually grow up. And that was really profound. And then we'll touch on all the other things that it says, I think, about transitioning life from childhood to adulthood, because I think everybody can connect with that. I thought he did it particularly well. I am curious to get your thoughts on how he portrayed women here. Like, do you think he did a good job with this? Like, I can't really speak to that, right? Like, it seemed interesting to me. He said he based off of, I read some of the, he based some of this was off of like his neighbors. He had some like teenage neighbors that would hang around and he would like talk to on occasion. And like, he was like, this is what they acted like. So I guess that's what he drew on.
I think definitely very, very bored teenage women. It was, I think that the thing about these characters is that it's not universal. Not everybody is this mean. Not everybody, creates a whole entire backstory based on somebody because, they're wearing a black t-shirt and like pretends that they're like, they must be goth, and then follows them around. But then in a lot of other ways, it was really refreshing because sometimes I think that we do erase, this aspect of people where most people, I know I certainly did, had to learn to all of this stuff. Like I had to learn that like other people are affected by your thoughts and actions. And even though like you think you're a nerd or a punk and, nobody really cares about what you're saying and what you're doing, like they do. I think that the book really nails that, even though it is, very hard to read in certain points.
Well, and it also struck me that these are the kind of characters I feel like we've seen men portray quite a bit, or boys. And it was refreshing, I think, to see young women in this role. Because, yeah, usually they're not the ones who get to be mean and kind of nasty to people and very sexual at times and, like, talk about things in this frank way that I think was probably pretty shocking. There's definitely an element of shock going on with this comic, right? It was probably pretty shocking to read, especially in the 90s. But it all works. I don't know. It all came together for me still, what are we like 30 years later now? And like, it still really worked for me, I thought.
I did feel like it was kind of true to life in that way too. Like I don't know about you, but I've encountered women in my life that were like this, especially at that age. And like, that's like the kind of gossip that goes on and like how far can you push it and what kinds of wild stuff can you say? And like, it's kind of naive to think that these kinds of conversations aren't happening in some storytelling. So to see that, I felt pretty true to life. Now, it does feel very 90s in the sense of like all the things that they're saying, like we've talked about, homophobic and just hateful, a lot of hateful stuff being thrown around, really. But I did also kind of identify with this whole paralysis, hopelessness kind of thing around that age where it's like, and I was thinking about like friendships. It brought me back a lot. It made me think about like friendship was so much different when you were this age. It was like you were like symbiotic. And as an adult, you just don't, those kinds of friendships, maybe you have them from when you were younger, but they don't typically develop, at least not in my experience, that in this way. Because there's so many options, it's paralyzing. Like you could do anything. And like there's some part of that feels like this, I don't know, suburbia kind of thing that it's captured here of like, I don't know, kids in the 90s and like having the world as their oyster, but also being like, this is all bullshit. And then kind of transitioning through that and realizing like, all these people are lame because they're a part of the system. And then I think by the end we get kind of their turns and their arcs turn into something that maybe they'd be making fun of themselves and their future selves and stuff.
I think they definitely would. They both end up becoming somebody that they would make fun of.
Yeah. And it is really refreshing, in a very strange way as a young girl and also as a woman reading this to see, girls being mean in a way that isn't just them kind of being catty to each other over a boy or something, like in that vein. It is interesting to kind of see them just being mean to everybody universally.
Just because they're kind of mean people.
They're mean people. They are.
So let's get into talking about Daniel Clowes a little bit. We've touched on some of his legacy. He was born in 1961. He's an American cartoonist, graphic novelist, illustrator, and screenwriter. Most of Clowes' work first appeared in 8 Ball, which we touched on, which was a solo anthology comic book series. Clowes' comics, graphic novels, and films have received numerous awards, including a PEN Award for Outstanding Work in Graphic Literature and over a dozen Harvey and Eisner Awards, and an Academy Award nomination. So he was born in Chicago to an auto mechanic mother and a furniture craftsman father. He was Jewish, whereas his father was, quote, reserved waspish Pennsylvania family. His upbringing was not religious, however. In 1979, he finished high school at the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools and attended the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, where he earned his BFA in 1984. It was here that he met and befriended cartoonist Rick Altergott, with whom he started the small press publisher Look Mom Comics. His first professional work appeared in the 1985 Cracked, and he contributed to that magazine until 1989, where in 1989, Fantagraphics published the first issue of his comic book 8 Ball. On issue number 1's masthead, Clowes described the anthology as, quote, an orgy of spite, vengeance, hopelessness, despair, and sexual provisiona. Provisiona? I don't know. I don't know if he made up that word, I think. 8 Ball lasted 23 issues, ending in 2004. One of the most widely acclaimed American alternative comics, it won over 24 awards, and all of Clowes' 8 Ball serials have been collected and released as graphic novels. From 1 to 18, an 8 Ball issue typically contained short pieces that ranged in genre from comical rant to Freudian analysis to fairy tale and cultural criticism. These issues also featured a chapter of a serial that Clowes later collected as a graphic novel, including Ghost World. He has several others that actually ended up spawning from this, but this is the one we're focusing on today. So, Ghost World was partially inspired by Clowes' own life. For example, he moved from Los Angeles to San Francisco, and he said that the town in the story is a visual combination of both places. Most of the novel is not written in chronological order, and he has said in interviews that he chose 2 teenage girls for his protagonists partly because he could use them to express his more cynical opinions without readers taking the characters as author surrogates. Which is interesting because also Enid Coleslaw is a anagram of Daniel Clowes. So, when I saw that, I was like, oh, that's so cool. So he rearranged and came up with Enid and Coleslaw, but talking about author self-insert. So clearly he identifies a lot with her, I think.
Yeah.
So as far as his context, historical context, his work emerged in late 1980s and early 90s in the American alternative comics scene and played an important role in comics achieving a new level of respect from reviewers, academics, and readers. Ghost World was among the earliest American literary comics to be marketed and sold through conventional bookstores as a graphic novel, which is a term that he has a lot of conflicting feelings about, from what I've read. Doesn't necessarily love it. We've encountered this elsewhere, where like some certain comic writers and artists don't love graphic novel as a term. I don't know like all of the reasons why. Is that something that you've heard a lot about, Jasmine? Like why people might not like that?
I have a suspicion that at least with Daniel Clowes, it might be because, like I was saying, like the comics with an X thing, like it's a whole different world, essentially. It's more along the lines of zines and that kind of thing. Whereas I think a lot of people think of graphic novels as Mouse and Persepolis and these kind of things.
So it's more prestigious sounding
when
you call it a graphic novel, but maybe that they don't want that.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the way that I look at it is comics are the single issue floppies, like, the magazines, and then the graphic novels are the collections or just the books. But it's been a debate for the last like 500 years.
Yeah, as many things are.
I'm always curious if some people in the comic community are like fighting for the term of comic to not be seen as like a derogatory thing. Because I think sometimes people are like, oh, that's a comic. It's kind of like, it's like, especially historically, it's kind of like a throwaway, in quotes, type of medium. Like it was printed on newspaper and stuff back in the day. And like, that's kind of like a viewpoint of some people, maybe some audiences and stuff. And I feel like sometimes people are like, anything that's, includes visual panels and the written word is a comic. And I think it's like maybe kind of just trying to democratize that space and say like, no, it's it should be seen in the same light as like a graphic novel or something like that.
Yeah. And I know there's a few people who, make a point to say like, I'm a cartoonist, or, I'm an illustrator, or I'm a comic book creator. And I think people are trying to let everyone know outside of comics that, it's all the same thing. It's kind of like the square rectangle thing where it's like they're all comics, but the graphic novel is, the collection of comics.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. But yeah, I can see that like the term maybe has some like connotations that people are uncomfortable with. Like it's somehow better now that it's a graphic novel, where it's like, no, it's still just a comic, but the comic, maybe we shouldn't be looking at that as something lesser. So in the late 1990s, he actually began work as a screenwriter. His first film was the adaptation Ghost World. So he wrote the screenplay for the film. He would also later write the screenplays for further adaptations of his work, Art School Confidential, which was released in 2006, and Wilson, which was in 2017. So there have been 2 other adaptations of his work, and I saw there were several others that have been optioned and haven't ever come out, but are in the works potentially. One thing that I actually really appreciated about this was that, I don't know, I just think it's really cool. I obviously like have a ton of respect for like Alan Moore, which we've covered on the on the podcast who wrote the comics but did not illustrate them. So I know that is definitely a space that is still extremely valuable and incredibly talented people can do it. I do also love to see when someone is also the illustrator as well, or the cartoonist, or whatever the proper terms are. I'm not sure. did the lettering himself, did everything himself, and wrote it. I think that's really cool. And in fact, as I was researching it, I found out about this. It's called rubylith, which is this like red sheet that he would put over the comic page that he would make, and then you have to remove all the parts that you want to have color. So that blue color, which is like all over the comic, he would go in by hand and have to cut this actual material off of the pages to remove, and like everything he cut would get that color to send to the printer. So that he was very, very particular about what was blue and what wasn't. Of course, this was back in the 90s, like, right? So this wasn't like a computer thing. He was doing this all by hand, which I thought was really cool. Just like the level of craftsmanship that goes into this, into the lettering, into everything else. And then that blue, he said that he chose it because he wanted to reflect the experience of walking home in twilight when every house has a television on and the living rooms are bathed in a ghostly blue light. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was cool because it was a very kind of moody blue that went throughout.
I was going to ask, I didn't know if there was an issue of this, like the original issue was in black and white, but it's really cool to hear that like, that was always an intention. And I love that, like, anyone who has that full control of their art, like we talk about auteur filmmakers and we talk about authors, obviously, that are so in control of their craft, like there's something about it. It's not better, but in some ways it's impressive is what I would say. Like that you have to be like a, multi-talented artist to be able to do all the things at the same time.
Sometimes you have to, I think, realize when you're like, I don't have the talent, so I'm going to get someone else to do this part of it for me. Like if I were to ever try and write a comic, I would not try and illustrate it because that would be a disaster. But it's, there is something cool about it when someone can do everything. That's just amazing.
It's so impressive, I think, because like if you think about it, in comic books, the artists are also, actors. Which I think for me, if I can't illustrate, but I think if I was a person who was good at illustrating things, I think that would be the hardest part for me because I'm also bad at acting. It's like, if somebody told me in a script, like, oh, okay, they look indecisive. I'm like, what does somebody look like when they're indecisive? But yeah, I mean, they're, I think it's so impressive because they're, they're the actor, they're the DP, they're the writer, they're the producer, they're doing everything. Whereas, when it's broken up, it is a little bit more, distributed, and you can be, while somebody is inking the pages, at the same time, somebody's also coloring it, who's, a completely different person. And it does feel in that way more like a film or TV show production.
Yeah.
But
we've introduced a level of collaboration too. Like often it's like the way those two artists can go back and forth and say like, oh, I actually want you to change this, and are they willing to do that? And like you can get all kind of thorny subjects there, but sometimes brilliance can come out of that too, right? Where they can affect each other and say like, oh no, I picture it this way, and maybe that changes something in the writing. So
yeah.
There's something really cool about collaboration that sometimes I'm envious of as someone who works in the more solo industry. But I wanted to give just a short synopsis of the comic, and then we can just kind of have a free-form discussion. We can jump into any particular parts that stood out. So, Enid Coleslaw and Rebecca Doppelmayr are two cynical, intelligent teenage girls who are best friends in the 1990s. They have recently graduated from high school and spend their days wandering around an unnamed town, criticizing pop culture and the people they encounter while wondering what they are going to do with the rest of their lives. They are attracted to boys, but also unhappily entertain the possibility that they might be lesbians. Their friendship is very close, but as the book goes on, tensions between them build, especially over Enid's plans to move away to college. They also have a quiet friend named Josh. Throughout the book, the two girls enjoy teasing him, but they are also attracted to him, and eventually a romantic triangle forms. All right, so that's a very bird's eye view of the comic, but of course there's all these little things that go on throughout. What stood out? What do we want to talk about first?
That's such an interesting synopsis because I feel like this is, the type of book where it's almost like the whole Seinfeld thing, where it's also kind of a book about nothing, but it's also a book about a lot of things. And I think my main takeaway from this is, it's about that weird transition between like right after high school where it's like, what are you gonna do? Like you really, this is the end of childhood. You can't be a kid anymore. And I think Enid really struggles with that. And I think Enid was allowed to get away with so much and just hand wave it away because, oh, she's a kid and now she's not anymore. And besides that, I think it's just really about privilege, I think. These are two very
Yeah.
privileged girls. And they're the last people to realize it, it seems like.
Yeah, I thought something interesting early on too is obviously realizing that a man wrote this, the way that men are interacting and talking in sexual manners to these women that are 18 years old. And I thought, like, with that whole adulthood transition from childhood to adulthood, they're not being perceived as kids anymore, even though they in effect are still children. And I know that that's something that I've heard from women in my life, and that like just like how early on that like sexualization happens. It was threaded in the story, like that first diner scene, I think. Immediately, and I was like, wow, it's like that as you go through the book and you realize these women are growing up, like they're learning to contend with older men who are preying on them in a sense, and like how these girls are so like worldly that they're firing back right away, like they're not taking anybody's bullshit.
One of the characters you're talking about here is this. We meet this John Ellis, who is the worst. Like, he's just an absolutely terrible person. And they seem to keep like associating with him for some unknown reasons, but he's like into Nazis, and like he has this friend who's created CGI, child, and he's like cool with it. And then like later he goes on TV to defend the guy. Awful person, right? And yet they're like, I don't know, that like joke that like they're into him, and it just makes me think about what you were talking about, because on like one hand I agree, like that's totally the men around them, right, are looking at them as in a sexualized way, but they're looking back at the world in a sexualized way too, as they're like now looking at things that way, I guess. And they don't seem like afraid of it, but maybe they are, because again, like we're only getting their words, we're not getting their thoughts. So I'm always wondering, like, is this a front? Is this like a posturing thing? Because maybe it is really scary, but like we're going to act like it's not, and maybe that's a way to like reclaim it or something.
I think that's really laid out in the scene where Enid is talking about how she lost her virginity to that Adam boy, and how she's like, yeah, I used to go to his house like every day, and we would just make out, and I kept like waiting for him to try and like push me to do more, and he never did. And it seems like, even though they kind of like expect certain things like that, like, at least Enid is really the driving force. And then when she has the opportunity to, maybe have a moment with Josh, who would actually probably be a good match and a good boyfriend and actually care about her, yeah, she starts, crying and doesn't actually want it. And yeah, it does seem like they don't know what they want.
Really interesting moment, right? She runs away, and right, like, and nothing happens in that moment. And she's been the one who's been like, I don't know, they both have had their moments where they're just like so overtly sexual and like teasing each other about it and like egging each other on in a way that like I'm very familiar with young boys doing, but not as familiar with seeing like young girls doing this. And just like trying to say the most shocking thing they can to each other often, right? And then, but in this moment, right, like it's a very different way it plays out, and that she ends up saying something about like, oh, I'm a terrible person or something, and then she runs off, and it's all caught up in this loss of innocence that is so on display throughout. And at first it's very subtle, I think, and then it builds up throughout. I was noticing a lot of the details that were sort of symbolic for that, including early on she has this like tchotchke that is something that she got as a kid, and she's selling all these things, but then the guy, it's like some random guy comes up and picks it up, and he's like looking at it, and he asks how much for it, and she's like, oh, that's not for sale. And she changes her mind, and she doesn't want to sell it. And then at the end of that particular chapter, she goes running back to it to make sure that it didn't get taken. So it's like her just really trying to hold on to this piece of her childhood. And we see this pattern actually play out a few more times, where there's a record that she's trying to find a copy of, and it's a record she listened to as a child. And she tries to find it everywhere. She can't find it, but she ends up finding it because her father actually finds it for her. And then like I think in one of the very next issues after, I think it's the moment where she almost has sex. The very next one starts off, they're in a playground and they're like too big and they're like going on the slide and they're in the on the the swing and stuff like that. And I was just like, it's such a great visual metaphor for these two women who are too big for this now. Like they're no longer children. And then they go visit like an amusement park and everything's less impressive than it used to be. And I used to be so scared of this, but now it's just kind of boring. And it's like about how that magic fades and like that childhood fades and you can't hold on to it. And I love how that metaphorically kept coming back over and over again.
Yeah, and I liked how the like lack of experience, but like sort of boisterous, like over the top nature, and how much they talk about sex, that kind of paints many different aspects of their lives. It's just a lack of experience. They don't know what they don't know, so they're talking big game, and then when push comes to shove, they want to be so independent, but her dad's the one who finds the record for her. She rushes back after she says, I don't care about any of this bullshit with the garage sale or whatever. She rushes back and finds that toy and she's holding it. And like, again, those like the leaving on, like, I just sat there and looked at that panel for a little while of her holding that. And you see so much innocence in that and how like trying to desperately to hold on to that childhood in a way. And like people do that to differing degrees. And I think many people can hold on to some sense of their childhood, but also in turn, on the other hand, they know that they have to move on and find some place in the world as an adult. The whole story sort of tying that together at the end with the largest, I think, conflict that these two characters are going through being, are they going to be friends? Are they going to stick together? Or is one of them going to go off to college? Which Enid acts like she doesn't care, but she's like, my dad's forcing me to take these tests and stuff. But clearly, like, you're not going to put the time in to actually study and do all of this stuff unless you also kind of cared about it. And so like that conflict between these two characters of, will they always be together? Is somebody going to move away? That feels like the thing that could break their childhood. And this like sort of, I don't know, teenage purgatory that they're living in right now in between childhood and adulthood.
Yeah. And it's also like, I think that's a weird pivotal moment in life where so much of your identity starts to really form. And, you kind of see this with both of them where I think their identity, like one of the parts that's probably also toxic about their relationship is that their identity really is based on each other. And at the same time, they're getting so much external input about who they are from people. Like that one character is constantly saying like, oh, like you're Jewish, so that's the only way I'm going to see you now, is I'm only going to like refer to you as like that Jewish girl, or, people are sexualizing them. And at the same time, like they're kind of putting that out into the world too. Every time, they like see some woman and they're like, man, like, how do you go through life with big boobs without being a slut? And it's like,
Yeah.
and it does kind of feel like they're just regurgitating this awful stuff that they might have heard. But it's, yeah, I love this segment where where Enid dresses punk rock, and then that one guy who used to be punk, he comes and says like, no, you gotta sell out. That's the most punk rock thing you can do. And then she like goes home and takes off her leather jacket. And she's like, I wasn't even trying to be punk.
Yeah.
And
Johnny Apeshit was that guy's name. And I thought that part was pretty hilarious. And like, it's so like, I don't know, like if you were a part of the sort of alternative lifestyles growing up, or you ever kind of were at the edge of the fringes where you were wearing, punk or metal or whatever, goth, whatever, like those little subcultures that develop. It was always fascinating to look back and see like who, kind of followed that as they grew up and who just completely went the other direction, right? And like I knew kids who were like Satanists who are now born again Christians and like super, and it's like sometimes people completely flip. And it was interesting because Johnny Apeshit, like, yeah, he's trying to like sell it to her as like, it's the most punky thing you can do is get into business and like start making money. Like you got to take the system down from inside, make all this money and then retire when you're 35. And it's like, all right, dude, you're not going to do that. And it's so funny because it's like so real though. Like people do that, and on one hand, like, I think they tell themselves a story so that they can like sell it. But then also, like, there is just a level of hypocrisy there, and she's sort of identifying that, and that is also just, like, I think always powerful. I saw somewhere someone compare this to Catcher in the Rye, but for Gen X. And I could totally see that of just, like, everything's phony, right? Like, I can't, like, society is so hollow and empty. Everybody's lying to themselves, and only I can see it. Like, there's an honesty to that youthful eye, I guess, where they can see it for the crap that it is. But then also, like, realizing that, like, that's life and you're going to have to engage with it. Like, you can't always remain above it all and cooler than everything. Like, eventually you kind of have to decide what you're going to actually do. I loved seeing the way that played out and how, they struggled with that. So one part I kept seeing discussed online, and I wanted to bring this to you too and see what your thoughts were, is the words ghost world. They appear multiple times at the start of every chapter, right? But sometimes, and maybe every time, they're, like, actually in the world. And in fact, one time they comment on them. They're like, oh, look, somebody spray painted that on this thing. So it's supposed to be in the world. It's like these words that keep appearing, ghost world, ghost world. What does that mean to you? Because I read a little bit about what Clowes has said, but I had, like, kind of my own take on it. But what were your thoughts on ghost world and why this is called that and why those words appear?
I always kind of imagine it as, like, it's almost like the death of the American dream in a really weird way. Like, this is a town that, like, I grew up in Southern California, so I always kind of imagined, like, Burbank or, certain parts of the valley where, so many of these buildings are just frozen in time, and we're kind of recycling, like, with the diner thing, where it's like, oh, we're, like, recycling this, like, happy life that was sold to us 5 generations ago. And it does kind of, sometimes when you're walking around towns like that, feel like you are in, like, a limbo or a ghost world. And I mean, I grew up in a really boring town, and it, I would absolutely describe it as that kind of, a ghost world where it's like, what am I supposed to do for fun? Oh, I don't know, just follow these people around, haunt them for a while, and then move on to the next thing. And it's kind of what I think.
Yeah, I like that.
I guess if I had to put an idea to what I think he was getting at, I mentioned before, this is like some sort of, like, purgatory between two different parts of your life, and how, like, it's like there's something kind of soulless to it because you like don't believe in anything, and it's not cool to like anything. So in that way, like, everything's kind of hollow. I just think, like, that weird space of, like, nothing really happening is what he's getting at.
So I read that he said that he saw it scrawled on a building in Chicago, and he found it really striking, but didn't really go into why, right? Why include it? Why put it in, use it as he did? So to me, I think he wanted it to be ambiguous. Many readers have attempted over the years to, like, come up with the reasons why. It seems like a lot of people see it as the characters being haunted by their childhood and by events in the past. That's what I saw a lot of. I don't know. I had a kind of a different take than that. So I was reminded of this quote from Louise Glück, who passed away a little while ago. She was a poet. She said, "We look at the world once in childhood. The rest is memory." And I was thinking about that, how to me it feels like these characters are mourning the death of their childhood. And there's a lot of, like, death symbolism and metaphor that goes on throughout. Like, they're in a graveyard. I think at the very start of the comic, they're standing in a graveyard. She buys a hearse to drive when she's getting ready to go to college, which I thought was a really interesting sort of metaphor once again for death. I'm gonna drive the Deathmobile, right? So I kept thinking that, like, she's viewing all of these people that she's judging, all of her friends who have grown up, as ghosts themselves and ghosts of their childhood selves, as if, like, that was the more authentic version, who is now kind of passed into this like shade of the person they once were. Which is a very depressing thought. I don't know that I fully agree with it, but I feel that way sometimes, I guess. And so I can kind of get there. And I think it's an interesting one. Like the world's populated with all these ghosts of children, if that's what we want to think of adults as.
I mean, yeah, and like we're kind of harboring the ghosts of our own childhood selves within us. But I do think there's something there because it's like on their little friend vacation, they go and see a bunch of dinosaurs and cavemen. It's like those are extinct,
Extinct.
and it's kind
Yeah.
of, carrying on that theme. Um, I did kind of also get the feeling that the first couple issues might have been less like well thought out about the themes.
Yeah.
And then like once I feel like the turning point for me was the diner scene, and like once they get to like Weird Al and all that stuff, like that was kind of where I felt like I was able to grasp onto things that he was trying to say in the beginning. It just kind of felt like mean mean children being bitter.
Yeah.
The diner stuff also forced me to think about the 90s looking back at the 50s, and then I was thinking of 2024 looking back at the 90s, and I was thinking of the time gaps in that, and I'm like, man, time, it feels like I don't know what it is. Maybe it has to do with like once the internet came about, things just changed, and things kind of felt the same for a while, because like the generations were so distinct, and looking back from the 90s to the 50s feels a lot different than looking back from the 2024 to like the 80s or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if this is on purpose or not, but I kind of got do you remember that conversation she has where she's like, I wish I could just dress like somebody from the 1930s
Yeah.
forever? Like the final few panels of the book, I think she is, because she has like a hat box when she jumps onto the bus. And I'm
Yeah.
like, is this her like starting her like weird 1930s wearing the same outfit everyday life? Like, is this who she's gonna be?
Well, she had that moment where she said that like she often dreamt about wanting to start over somewhere,
Mhm.
just move somewhere and just be a new person. Um, and that brought me to like another big theme I think that I was resonating with, which is about like hometowns and like being in the space you grew up in and feeling stuck there. And how some people leave and some people don't, right? Some people live there their entire lives and other people leave, right? And they have different reasons for doing that. And sometimes those two people can be very similar up to a point, and then at a certain point they diverge. And that's literally what we see happen with Becky and Enid here, where Enid leaves, gets on the bus, which I thought was also a really cool callback, because there was this character that they had seen, not really much of a character, there's a person they saw who, the thing about this guy is he's always waiting for a bus that doesn't come. He's been there for years waiting for this bus and it never comes. And then one day he's just gone. And they're like, well, what happened? So I don't know. I love that. Like the idea of waiting for a bus that never comes, but then even that can't last. And then I thought of that again when at the end she's literally getting on a bus to leave, right? Because she doesn't get into college. She fails the test. But it's funny because it still marks sort of the end of their friendship. Becky ends up being the one who gets with Josh, and then it seems like that is part of what creates a gulf between them. Also maybe the fact that Enid wanted to leave, even though she didn't, was enough of a sort of betrayal of that friendship. Because there was a moment where it seemed like Becky was like, I'm going to come move there, and we're going to continue to be friends, and it's going to be like it was. And Enid's like, that's kind of weird. And she's like, oh, that is kind of weird, I guess, right? And Becky is also the one who repeatedly talks about, like, maybe I am a lesbian, and they both kind of laugh it off, but, like, it seemed like there was a real kind of tension there of, like, what if we are? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know if he was really getting at that or not, but you could also view this as, like, an unexplored romantic relationship that is sort of left behind along with childhood. So what I was saying before about that theme, though, I've been listening to an indie pop artist named Noah Kahn, which our younger listeners might know. I went and saw him in concert recently, and my wife actually got me into him. And digging into the lyrics of his most recent album, Stick Season, a lot of it is about his complicated feelings about his hometown. And so I've been thinking a lot about this recently because I identify that, because I also have a lot of complicated feelings about my hometown. And then I was seeing that coming up in this book too, and how like there's a lot of like things that you can love about it while also feeling trapped by it. And there's like I don't know, like he has a different tone in that album, but here it was a lot about like Enid, at least I think, realized she wasn't going to stay. She's like, I got to get out of here, and she gets on the bus and leaves. But she doesn't seem like spiteful or angry at Becky, who has found Josh and seems happy now and has grown into, I think she says, like a beautiful young woman. But she doesn't actually even say it to her. She says it to herself, like outside. She's looking into the diner, and then she gets on the bus and leaves. But it's clear that their friendship has just cooled. And I thought it was so spot on where they have this moment where they're like, oh, we should get together sometime. Oh, totally, we should do that. And then they clearly don't. Because that's all often how it goes, right? Like you just kind of drift apart. I don't know where I'm going with all of this. It's just kind of scattershot thoughts. Anybody have any reactions?
I mean, I kind of talked about this before, but like you make different kinds of friends when you're younger too. Like, and I think like to look back, you can feel some sorrow for like those friendships that don't exist anymore, but there's kind of a reason that they don't. Like they were the friends that were there at the time that they were, and they were right for that time period. But yeah, I mean, it made me think about like, yeah, people that sort of were important day to day and then just like, you know, don't even exist in your life as much anymore. And that seems like the relationship that these two have. And that's just like those feelings are so intense when you're that age. And then you get away from it for a while, and it just yeah, it's really strange how you can just change as a person, like you were talking about, Luke. Like you can, whether you leave or whether you just grow up into a different person, like you can look back and see the people that you knew, and maybe you don't even like those people or identify or relate to them anymore, and that's, you know, something that can happen.
I did think it was really interesting that Enid seems to be the one who is, you know, initiating almost a friendship breakup and is almost mourning the loss of the friendship and the loss of childhood as they're still together, even because Enid seems to be the more like impulsive one. Like she's always the one who's kind of like pushing the limits, and Becky's kind of like, hey, like I don't want to follow these people, or like, can you not speak so loud? Or, oh, and I think that in a way, I think Enid is self-aware, even though she kind of pretends to not be, and is at least self-aware enough to know that this friendship isn't going to serve them for much longer. Honestly, I think that when Enid is talking about Josh and says, I think she says like, you can have my sloppy seconds, I guess. Like I should just
Yeah.
date him until I leave. I think she's urging Becky to like step in before she can, because she wants to get, it's almost like a weird sad parting gift
Oh,
for
that's
their
interesting.
friendship, is like,
Yeah, because
here, have
it's
Josh.
portrayed as if it's a secret from Enid, right? Like they're kind of doing it behind her back. But you're right, we never really see Enid being upset about it. Maybe
Yeah,
she was kind of okay with it. I actually like that read a lot.
yeah,
I felt like there was some part of Enid that knew that she was leaving, but didn't necessarily want to deal with the impending sort of conflict that was going to come out of that, of like losing your friends and, you know, leaving home and not having the safety net of your family. So she, that's why we see her like grappling with all the childhood stuff and trying to really hold on to it for this last little bit, because it's like ripping that Band-Aid off. It's coming, and it's just like a period of time.
yeah. And I think that that really is like the hardest way to leave any relationship, right? Is like, you didn't do anything wrong. Like we're not in a fight. We just kind of outgrew each other, you know? And that's, I think that's really poignantly shown in this book. It's hard to define.
We should talk a little bit about Bob Skeets, who I don't know. I assume this must be the character who Buscemi plays in the movie, and it must be a combination of multiple characters or something, because I was trying to figure out who he was, and I'm like, this guy he's not there for hardly at all. And then, but at the end, he is there, and he gives her like an astrological reading, which doesn't, like, I don't know, doesn't seem like an astrological reading. It's just some sort of like psychic reading. And he talks about seeing a bunch of different branching pathways, but like all of them end in like loneliness and shadows or something. Like it's very depressing. And then he's like, of course, he's like, but to get the full data, you'll have to come get her like a full reading. Which I don't know if he was trying to sell that to her or be creepy. Like I don't know what was going on there, but like, he was not willing to give her the full info. I don't know, like what was the point of him? And we start off with them being really into this comic. And then they talk about this Bob Skeets guy. I think he's at the diner a couple times making some commentary. But like, why is he important?
I realized that Enid was like fascinated with oddballs and quote unquote weirdos and everything like that throughout the story, which, I think is being involved in the visual arts and photography at times. I think like people think that everyone wants to look at models or they want to look at this, but I always find that like some of the most fascinating things you can look at are people who look unique. And I think like Enid's searching the world for people who she identifies with in a sense. And like, I like that. And so she finds this person that they're like obsessed with this guy. They're like, we got to go, he's going to turn up at this place. He always goes to this diner at this time. And they're trying to stalk and find this guy, just to like, I don't know, kind of observe him.
Yeah.
And then nearing the end, he gives this like psychic reading that he like pitches into a full astrological reading. And what I got out of the scene was really what follows it. Is he's building up like this, you have all these pathways you can go down and they're all ending in darkness or whatever. Then we cut to her life, and I think we're to assume that based on like her outlook on the world, she chose a path and then it led to possible darkness.
Yeah.
And I think that that's just like something that you have to almost kind of like bite the bullet on and say like, I gotta make a decision, and whether it's the right one or not, I have to do something here and progress my life. And hopefully you can kind of grab the steering wheel and kind of end up where you want to, but you never know. It's a risk.
I did like, I don't know why I was thinking this, but a part of me did think that some of the men, including Bob Skeets, were a little bit of like self-insertion on Daniel Clowes' part.
Well, there's a full-on self-insertion, right?
David
Yes.
Clowes, yeah.
We did not talk about that. There is a moment where she is like, thinks this cartoonist is hot, and he's coming to do a signing, and it's Daniel Clowes himself. But she goes to the signing to talk to him, and he's like alone, and nobody's there to talk to him. And she's like, "Oh, he was an old perv. I didn't want to actually introduce myself to him." And she like leaves without talking to him, which it was an interesting moment. Definitely. I don't know, very meta. It's like self-insertion, self-deprecating, obviously. Calling him an old perv. It was funny.
I thought it was just going to be a name drop too, right? Like
Yeah.
I thought it was going to be, oh, this is his name, move on. And then the scene where she actually goes there and she's like afraid to talk to him, seemingly like she's kind of intimidated or something. But yeah, the author calling himself a perv is pretty interesting. Yeah. You were saying, Jasmine, about the men in general.
Yeah, because I think that Bob Skeets actually weirdly had a lot in common with Enid. Like the fact that, when they first meet, he kind of jumps into this conversation that she's having and like gives his own take on why he, what he thinks their backstory is. And I think there's like a little part of him, of Daniel Clowes, that's kind of like, what business does this man have speaking with this like teenage girl? Like, even if he is trying to be completely harmless, like, what, why are you jumping in and giving your opinion to this child?
It seems to me that he, like, as we're talking about it, honestly, it's kind of occurring to me that he kind of seems like not a gatekeeper, but just like he is an oddball who is now an adult. He has navigated the adult world as a very strange person. Mm-hmm. And I think Enid is drawn to those people, right? Like the supposed Satanists who maybe aren't Satanists. And other just strange, like maybe that's why she likes this guy who's terrible, is that he's weird. And she's like looking at them and going like, what does a strange person like me end up doing in life? Like, how can I exist in this world where it seems like everybody has to conform? And her and Becky go those two different routes, right? Becky's working at like a bakery at the end, and she's, got a boyfriend, and she's at the diner in in their town. And, she seems to have kind of given up the like quest to become the like, I don't know. It's kind of a hipster idea, right? Like, in fact, at one point, Josh kind of nails it because Enid's like, very dismissive of like, what even am I? You can't even define my style. He says, to defy definition. And it's like 3 words, and it completely nails it.
Yes.
She's just like, yeah, to a T. It's exactly what she is. Because in her own way, she has defined her own specific style or her own specific like vibe. I think she's trying to figure out like, if I want to be that going forward, and I don't want to like sacrifice my ideals, how can I exist in this world? And maybe Bob Skeets represents just like a certain path or someone who's found a way to do it.
I mean, because I think that it's all about like she's a contrarian, but it's like if you're a contrarian to everything, then what are you? And I think
Right.
Bob Skeets is like if she took that path just all the way down and just was like everything that people think is good, I'm gonna think the opposite, and that's my whole personality. And I think that when they're all watching him on TV, it is a wake up call in a way. But yeah, I mean, that's again, like it does feel like Enid is trying to figure out who she is and where she belongs.
Well, I'm really curious to see how they adapt this into a film. It seems like, especially with him being the screenwriter, this seems like he had another chance to come back to this story, figure out what he was trying to say, figure out a way to like package it into a 2-hour-ish movie, and tell a compelling story. So I'm really fascinated to see what this movie's like. And Jasmine, you're going to return next week and talk with us about the movie.
Yes.
Very excited for that. Before we let you go, would you like to tell our listeners about anything you're working on right now? I know there's a comic you're currently working on that you said is available for pre-order. You want to talk about that?
Yeah. So right now I'm currently editing a book called Hardstyle Juice. It's kind of like a murder mystery wrestling comic. It's issues 1 through.
I looked it up. It looks really cool.
It's so good. I love wrestling, so I'm a little biased, but it's brilliant. And also, like, the whole team is wonderful, and they're such big wrestling fans. And I'm so happy to be on this book. But issues 1 through 3 are available on Kindle /Comixology. And then, the printed edition should be out, I think, probably sometime next year. But single issues are available now on digital.
I will link Amazon links to it in the show notes. But I also went ahead and added a bunch of the other comics that you've edited over the years to our guest list of books on our bookshop. So if people are interested in checking out that work, we highly recommend it, and use our bookshop link, and then that helps us as a show. But thank you so much for coming on, Jasmine. We will talk to you again next week.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Thanks, Jasmine.
So if you enjoyed this episode, please let us know in the form of a rating and review. If you're on YouTube, leave us a like and a comment and let us know what you feel about Ghost World. We'd love to hear from you.
And be sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink2Film.
And if you'd like to support this podcast in another way, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/Ink2Film, and on there we do bonus content, other adaptations. We just did an Alice in Wonderland adaptation. At some point here in the future, we will do another Solaris adaptation, also just experimental stuff, other kinds of episodes. So if you'd like to join us on there, we'd love to have you.
And thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, that's going to be it for this week, and until next time,
keep adapting.